chosen the title Migration, Ethics and Exploitation. So, Ben, over to you. Would you like to address us and feel free to speak for 30 minutes or a bit longer if you feel able, if you feel happy.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Robert, and well done for getting Medaille Trust pronounced correctly first time. That is unusual, I have to say. It's usually I've heard a few different versions of it, but it is Medaille Trust. So thank you for that, and thank
I'm
you very
trying to guess what they
much.
would be.
Yeah, you've no idea. Thank you very much for inviting me here this evening. I do a lot of talking about immigration for a living. I work, as you've heard, with the Medaille Trust, which is a charity looking to confront modern slavery and human trafficking. I used to be an advisor on migration policy. I've edited a book on approaches to migration, and I'm also a professional writer on religious issues and the role of faith in society. So I do a lot of talking about immigration, politics, and religion, and I am therefore one of the UK's least popular dinner guests. But except that I start with that predictable joke, except that of course it isn't really true at all. One of the strangest myths in British public life is that migration is some sort of taboo subject which people don't like talking about. And that is in fact not something that I've ever found. I find, in fact, that it's become in many ways a dominant mode of conversation within a huge part of British life, sometimes bizarrely so. And that is driven, of course, by an enormously high media salience, by political interest, and legitimately high public interest, not least, I think, which comes from living in an increasingly mobile and globalized world. And that makes a huge difference in terms of not only how much easier it is for people to move much further and much faster than they ever were at any point in human history previously, but also in their ability to communicate over greater distances, and the role of the diaspora, of groups communicating back between the home country and that place to which they've migrated, is a huge under-researched pull factor, an issue in migration these days, which is not perhaps discussed enough. But for all that sort of salience and breadth of conversation on migration, I'm rarely convinced that there's an awful lot of depth or clarity to it. And on this note, politicians and media from across the political spectrum are much to blame. Nothing is more common or more dangerous than the four fatal words uttered by politicians all the time: it is right that. It is right that is a statement which can come before almost any policy announcement, and does frequently, and is
Mm.
always a dangerous and glib phrase. It's, of course, a moral statement. It is right is a moral statement, and a fairly absolutist one at that. It's not offering a great deal of nuance or alternative. And politicians don't half love to throw that word around. But what I want to try and do today is to argue that before we say it is right on a migration policy, we need to, at the very least, show our working a bit, get behind that. And I want to clarify in particular three different sets of moral actors that have to be part of that equation, two of which are often left out. The first is states, nation states, and that's always included. But the other two are migrants themselves and then wider British society. And those two moral actors in the migration space are often ignored, with human consequences which come from that ignoring, which again, I think is an under discussed part of the picture. But let's start with states. States are all powerful. We live in a world which is defined by the power of nation states. And we can talk about human rights and universal rights, but it's always imperative to remember that although you can talk about human rights and universal rights and European rights, these rights only exist insofar as a nation state, with its national courts and national judiciary, are prepared to enforce them. Your ability to make a claim on your universal human rights is limited by the state in which you live. And that is a point which we could make with any number of examples, from humanists in Bangladesh to gay men in Nigeria to etc., etc., etc. Your ability to claim your human rights and your universal rights is impinged upon by the state in which you are born. The most valuable thing that you can own is the passport of a developed Western nation. That is the single biggest predictor of your life chances, is the country in which you were born. Nothing else comes close. It is statistically far better to be born poor in the UK than rich in the vast majority of the developing world. In terms of your life outcomes, your education, your health, your lifespan, all of these, the country in which you're born is the single most important statistical factor. To be stateless, therefore, to not be a citizen of a country, removes you, in Hannah Arendt's famous phrase, from the right to have rights. Because it is that state, it is your status within a state which defines that right. And that is why refugees are so vulnerable, or asylum seekers are so vulnerable. It's because they don't have that until a new state recognizes them or provides some sort of protection. It's why it was also so controversial when the UK brought in legislation which would allow it to strip citizenship from people who might be eligible for citizenship in another country, most famously with the ISIS bride, Shamima Begum. That was removing the right to have rights, in effect. That was the controversy. Not that someone shouldn't be punished for going to join ISIS, but that in saying that this person was no longer a citizen, you were removing that status and protection that they had. States, therefore, immensely powerful. How does the UK use this immense power? How does it consider the principles when it comes to migration? I want to argue that the British have historically measured the success of its immigration policy by two criteria, which are not remotely compatible, are quite different, and which frequently gets it into a muddle on all sides of the spectrum. The two criteria are economics and integration, or you can prefer identity for the latter one if you want, but economics and integration. On economics, the British state assesses the success of its migration policy according to the economic benefit that migrants provide versus the economic harm that they cause. It's a calculation. This is explicit in terms of how the last several governments have operated. To come to this country from most of the world, you need a visa, that is normal enough. You can come as a tourist to spend money. You can come as a student to spend money and contribute to our research. You can come under very limited circumstances as a family member, but only if you can definitively prove that you can financially support yourself and will never be reliant on the state's largesse to do so. You can come, a small number of people relatively can come from Ukraine or Hong Kong on specific humanitarian visa routes, or a very, very small number of select refugees are resettled from various countries. Or you can come as a so-called economic migrant, though as I'll say later, I don't particularly like the term. But as an economic migrant within the UK, there are visa routes available for entrepreneurs, for people of special talents, Premiership footballers and the like, or for just your standard economic migrant. And for that, you can come to the UK if you have a job offer from an organisation which has paid to sponsor you and which pays a fee to the government each year to do so. You also have to pay a special tax for using the NHS. You pay for your visa and for any renewals of that visa that might be required at any point. And you have to demonstrate that you are being paid a salary of £38,700 a year, or filling a job on the shortage occupation. That is jobs where there is such a shortage of British workers that the British state in its magnanimity says we will take a few of you to fill, for example, jobs in social care or in agriculture. Now that is explicitly designed, and this is in the government comms, to bring in the best and the brightest. That is the language which is used. The seeking of high-skilled migration, by which we actually mean high-waged migration. High wages and high skill are not actually remotely the same thing, but for the purposes of this exercise, the government defines high skill migration as those who are paid over £38,700 a year. And you'll often hear about the economic benefits of migration as around things like filling particular job shortages, boosting the economy, paying in taxes and contributions. Migrants in this model are thoroughly dehumanized. They are essentially fuel for the British economic machine. And so long as they are fueling that machine, they are welcome to come here. But their value is contingent on what they provide. And we've made it increasingly difficult over a number of years to do anything other than simply be fuel. So, for example, it is much more difficult than it ever used to be for an economic migrant to bring a family member with them, because those people are not of economic value or not deemed to be of economic value. And therefore, it is very, very difficult. If you have, for example, a social care visa in this country, you are banned from bringing a family member with you. The same now for PhD students, which never used to be the case. And on the negative side of that economic calculation are calculations about the cost of migration, which is usually seen in terms of the strain on institutions, schools, hospitals, things like that. Or in terms of deflating salaries in particular industries, though that argument is more rarely made at policy level than it is in parts of the press. One of the more insidious ways in which you see this economic argument being used, and full demonstration that this is not just a problem on the political right, but also very much on the political left, is when you hear supposedly left-wing pro-migration people, the chef Jamie Oliver being a good example, who like to come out with this lazy trope about lazy British workers compared to hard-working migrants who are prepared to do the jobs that the British don't want to do. I would argue that there is nothing particularly progressive or moral about keeping wages low by paying migrants in intolerable conditions that nobody born here would accept. I don't think that's a progressive case. I don't think it's a positive case for migration. I work in the modern slavery sector, and I have a charity with safe houses which are full of people who've come to work in the care sector or the agricultural sector. And yes, they were working very hard. They were also exploited. They were slaves. And we shouldn't be putting this out as a kind of progressive sign of how good it is that these people are doing things that we wouldn't expect British people to put up with. But nevertheless, the overall case there, the economic case, is that the British state values migration according to economic value. There is this other criteria, which is around integration or identity, which is, I suppose, the extent to which it's felt that migrants have become part of the British community, part of the British people, and concerns to which they might undermine that. And this is the second criteria by which immigration policy is kind of played out. So you have things, for example, like Norman Tebbett's famous cricket test, questioning who will the children of Indian or Pakistani migrants support in a cricket match between England and India or Pakistan. That's one example of a kind of cultural worry, but there are many others, and the UK has really bought into this, and this again goes back at least 25 years in terms of tightening the kind of cultural criteria by which people can come here. So, for example, every few years, the UK has increased the language requirements on particular visas so that you can't come unless you can already demonstrate that you speak English. This is typical of a European trend, which can go a lot further in other places. In France and in Germany, there is legislation in particular areas which bans particular clothing, headscarves, burqas, for example. Or in some parts of the south of France and south of Germany, there were requirements on schools to serve pork without halal or kosher exceptions. This in the name of integration, to force Jews, but really Muslims, to integrate into French or German society. In one particular case, a German municipality in Bavaria, though this I would say was overturned by a high court, but this municipality tried to insist that any migrant who moved into the municipality signed up to a values statement, some of which were more vanilla than others, but one of the more interesting ones was that any migrant moving to this town was going to have to indicate a support for gay marriage. This was not on progressive grounds. This was purely trying to prevent conservative Muslims from moving to that town. It was seen as a Muslim test. You could tell by that, but it was brought in a state which retains church taxes, which go to the Catholic Church, and was the home of Joseph Ratzinger, the later Pope Benedict XVI, who was famously not a particularly enthusiastic supporter of gay marriage himself. But apparently already living there, he would have been fine, whereas people moving in would have had to have signed this value statement. These are cultural markers, but they also get expressed in other ways. For example, in an increased securitization agenda. One of the things which marks this out is targeting whole groups for immigration bans, either by nationality or by faith. So, for example, in his first term, Donald Trump's ban on people from Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, or Yemen in 2017 was a blanket ban policy, which was simply preventing people from particular nationalities coming into the US. And really, it was a Muslim ban. That was what it was intended for. He has promised in his second term that he's going to extend that to Gazans, incidentally. But this is the use of, in the name of security, excluding large groups of migrants from being able to come. And this is a very old trend. It's one, in fact, of the oldest trends in US migration policy. One of the first ever major migration policies in US history was the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act. And what that did was it ranked all the nationalities of people who wanted to migrate to the USA by desirability and put quotas on them. So for those from stereotypically Protestant, hardworking Northern European countries, Germans and Scandinavians and the British, there were a lot of places available. There were far fewer for Italian and Balkan states, and none at all for Asian migrants. They were barred. It is interesting when you look at our own approach to refugees in the UK now. The UK made really quite a generous package available to Ukrainian refugees and to some extent to Hong Kongers. The press release announcing the Hong Kong scheme is instructive. It's an interesting example of how integration and economics interplay, because it made a point of the shared values between Hong Kong and the UK, but also mentioned that a kind of stereotypical view of all Hong Kongers as being extremely entrepreneurial people. And it even put a number on the benefit, the financial benefit, which the UK would accrue from allowing in lots of entrepreneurial Hong Kongers into the country. I think it put it at 50 billion value to the UK economy over 10 years. Compare and contrast these very generous offers with that offered to every other refugee or asylum seeker who tries to reach the UK. And it is chalk and cheese, even for those groups that are themselves Commonwealth nations, perhaps in sub-Saharan Africa. There is no comparison in terms of the offer, which is phrased in terms of cultural similarities. I think it's an open conversation point how much more culturally similar Ukrainians and the British are to, say, Nigerians and the British. And it would suggest that culturally, it's perhaps not as relevant as the colour of their skin in terms of some of these calculations which were made by government. What is interesting is that you have these two criteria, your economics and your integration. They dominate the discussion about migration, but what is rarely acknowledged is they're really different, and they might in fact be completely incompatible. And this is the muddle which so much of the politics across the spectrum gets into. On the one hand, it wants to talk about the best and the brightest and economic utilitarianism. And on the other, it wants to talk about values and British identity and similarity. And so what you get from that is policies from the same government which don't remotely match up to one another. Boris Johnson, to give just one example, talked a big game about reducing migration, appointed, I think it's fair to say, some of the scariest, the most hardcore Home Secretaries that the UK has ever had, but also signed multiple trade deals which explicitly increased economic migration from India and from other places. Economic migration under Boris Johnson went up dramatically, even as the narrative was about reducing net migration and about concern about takeover. These are just this, and this isn't, it's easy to take pot shots at the hypocrisy of Boris Johnson, who hasn't, but this is not atypical of British politics across the political spectrum. Of course, it is possible to be very economically beneficial to the UK and not to integrate at all. The Russian oligarch who buys a West London football club pumps millions, perhaps billions, into the UK economy without ever learning the language or doing anything to integrate into British society. On the other hand, I have a friend who is more British than any person I've ever met, who swears by sticky toffee pudding, but he is sadly a journalist and therefore of no economic value to the UK at all. And this is an example of how, these two criteria of integration and economic value, they're not the same thing. And trying to have your cake and eat it is part of the mess which the state gets into. But note also that both of these criteria are based entirely on the assumption that we should assess migration according to the needs of the nation state. Lost in that is the question of what it means for migrants themselves. What is the success and the benefits that accrue to those individuals? It also tends to ignore, just as an aside, the states from which people migrate. The focus is almost always on the states where people arrive and not where they've left. But to give you just one example, in the 8 years since Romania, the first 8 years since Romania had free movement within the EU, 50% of its doctors emigrated. For the very simple reason that it was possible to earn significantly more as a taxi driver in Paris than as a doctor in Bucharest. No analysis was ever really made of what that would mean for the Romanian healthcare system. Open borders is a wonderful idea until all your doctors depart. It's a brilliant idea if you're a country that wants people to come in. For those countries which are sending countries, it takes on a bit of a different dimension. I was recently in Albania. In Albania in 1991, the population was 3.5 million. Today, it's estimated to be about 2 million. So from 3.5 to 2 million in a generation. That is an exodus. And the same was true of a large part of the Balkans, of the Baltics. It's happening in large parts of Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. When you see these countries electing increasingly xenophobic nationalist populists, bear in mind that firstly, there is a real credible risk that their culture and national identity, so hard won back after years of communism, really is vanishing out from under them as all the young depart. And two, that those who are voting for these increasingly xenophobic nationalist popular governments are the literal left behinds when, half the Albanian population has left in a generation. That those that are left behind have some reason to feel resentful. The exodus, of course, is largely of the young, of the ambitious, of the educated, those who have language skills, those who have transferable skills which are desirable to developed countries, which might lead one to ask, what is the incentive for a developing country to invest in education if it's just propping up healthcare in the developed world who do not compensate a penny for those brilliant people who've departed? That's an ethical impact which I think is often lost in the wash. And it's not to say that blocking immigration would necessarily help developing countries, because I don't think that's necessarily true. It's far more complicated. But it is to say that analysis of the benefits of migration very rarely takes account of the fact that when you take the best and the brightest, that means they're not in the countries from who trained them and brought them up in the first place. But that's still according to the needs of states. What about people on the move themselves? What about migrants as moral actors? And the question I want to ask there, which I think is often surprisingly under-asked, is why do people move? It might be obvious in some cases, but on the whole, throughout human history, people have not tended to want to move too far from their homes. So why is it that in 2020, the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, estimated that there were 281 million people in the world living outside the country of their birth? That's about 4% of the whole world's population were migrants in 2020. And that is in 2020, which was, during the COVID-19 crisis, when movement was actually quite difficult. The real number is probably higher than that. There were also 90 million displaced people in 2020. Those are people who, for whatever reason, are not living in their own homes due to war, oppression, persecution, or increasingly due to the impact of climate change. Most of those are internally displaced. They're moved within their own country. But there are also 30 million refugees in the world, 2020. That's a decent sized country. That is forced migration. And everyone, I think, broadly agrees that that is a thing. But we also talk about economic migrants. And for all sorts of reasons, I don't particularly like the term. I think it's oversimplistic. And to give you just one example, take someone who lives in say, sub-Saharan Africa, in a place of terrible life outcomes, political corruption, poor healthcare, chronic poverty, that person is not necessarily persecuted. But in order to have any kind of chance of development, have any chance of their children moving forward, having a better life, they want to move. Is that forced migration or is that an economic migrant? Well, the reality is it's both, or at least it's a part of both, and it falls somewhere in the middle. And our asylum system, one of the reasons of the much discussed backlog is because it's really complicated. Actually, not many people do fall very easily into the category of just a refugee or just an economic migrant. The reasons people move include a fair bit of both. The majority of people who move, of that 381 million, the vast majority of people who move are doing so to seek some sort of improvement in their life situation. That is their agency to do that. And there's a certain irony in when we're talking about agency, that the Western refugee system tends to punish agency. In every other form of our kind of welfare system, it's all for agency and people putting themselves up by their bootstraps, but not the asylum and refugee system, which is positively disempowering. Which is perceived as the good refugee, the legitimate refugee, is the one who waits in a camp to be selected. He's sort of a passive individual. Whereas the person who goes and gets under their own steam to a place is somehow seen as jumping the queue. What queue? But even if there were a queue, it's a strange irony that it's only in this kind of particular field where we discourage people to take a kind of say in their own agency. Of course, it's mostly young men who make it to the UK. Who else would survive the journey? It's immensely dangerous. The idea that because somebody is a young man, they're not a legitimate refugee is one of the strangest kind of myths which has been allowed to take hold in a large part of this debate. And more broadly, we should ask the question, why should being a refugee mean that you lose agency about your choices? If you were already leaving your home country, if you were forced to leave, why shouldn't you have some say in where you want to make your new life? Somewhere you can succeed economically, somewhere where you might have cultural ties or speak the language. If people wanted to go to Rwanda, they could get to Rwanda. The fact they chose to come to the UK rather than Rwanda in the first place should suggest that that's something we ought to take seriously. I do a lot of work in Albania, and that is because Albania is the country which has the largest number of trafficking and modern slavery victims who come to the UK. And recently I was in Albania and I met a guy up in the north, up in the mountains. And he was telling me about why he'd gone to the UK. He lives up in a fairly small town. There aren't many jobs locally. The best job going locally is in hospitality, for which he stands to earn, if he gets the job, because there aren't many of them, about €200 a month in the good touristy seasons and nothing in the bad months. Worse than that, all of his friends, anyone with ambition, all the girls he fancied and wanted to have a relationship with or possibly to get married to, anyone with ambition has left. They all go. In his particular region, Kukes County up in the north, 80% of under 25s leave in any given year. This is a kind of hopeless situation. But my friend that I met there, he's not a skilled migrant. He had no particular appeal to big Western nations to which he might want to leave. Albania is not in the EU. It does not have free movement. You need a visa to get anywhere. So what did he do? Well, he knows there's a big Albanian community in the UK, and for the right price, and it's currently going at about £30,000, which you take on as debt, a gang will bring you to the UK with a promise of work and accommodation on the other side. So that's what he did. He took on the £30,000 debt, got himself sealed into the back of a lorry, and arrived safely through Dover Port and was working in London. What was he working in? Well, the gang's business was drugs. So that's what he was working in. He was dealing Class A drugs. He was not a master criminal. He was caught within a few months. He spent 6 years in Wolverhampton prison and was then deported back to Albania. where I met him not long after he'd landed. And I asked him what he was doing now. And he said, well, I'm planning on how I get back to the UK. Because the situation to which I've been returned is no better than the one that I left in the first place. And the only real economic option which I see open to me is to take on another £30,000 debt to a different gang and see if I have better luck this time. Fairly self-evidently, the UK's deterrence policies, which we have invested tens of millions of pounds in every year, aren't having much of an impact if people are prepared to lock themselves in a shipping container for a second time after a 6-year prison sentence to come back here. But why would they when there's a large diaspora, huge discrepancies in economic prospects, a total lack of development in many sending countries, and lots of criminals willing to take advantage of people? It's no wonder, no mystery, why immigration to the grey and black economy is so high in the UK. But of course, there is a moral question there. My friend knew that the offer from the gang was going to be illegal. He knew it was illegal to enter the UK in that way. He's not a refugee. He wasn't persecuted. Some people in Albania are persecuted, but he is not. He wanted to earn more money. He wanted to be ambitious. He wanted to connect with his community. He suspected that the job he was going to be offered wasn't on the level either. Albanians are not naive. They know that most of the gangs are linked into criminal activity. He clearly has agency and moral choices, though fewer than people in other contexts might enjoy. But we can't ignore the fact that he made a moral choice to do something illegal, and no one is justifying the behavior of dealing Class A drugs. But we must begin to unpick the underlying factors that will persuade a 22-year-old guy to take on a £30,000 debt to get himself locked in a lorry, which last year took the lives of several hundred people trying to cross that way into the UK, in order to try and get a better life. You can't deter your way out of that situation. Nothing that the UK government does is more dangerous than the situation which these people are already pushing themselves into. And before we can begin to get into that discussion about why people are prepared to do that, then discussions about migration are always going to fall a bit flat. Now, of course, within our asylum and modern slavery system, there are people who are frauds. Not as many, I think, as the Home Office say there are, but there are some. I've certainly seen people who, I think that story sounds remarkably similar to several others I've heard this month already. And of course, no one's suggesting that you don't have a duty to protect society, to remove criminals, terrorists, those who are out to cause harm. Those can't be the only things that we look at in this kind of moral picture. I would say that from the perspective of migrants, they deserve as a minimum two things. The first is to be heard. The Rwanda policy was indefensible to my mind, not because it was sending failed asylum seekers, because it wasn't. It wasn't proposing to send people to Rwanda that had got here. We'd looked into their case, decided they weren't on the level, and were then sending them somewhere else. That wasn't what it was. It was taking everyone who arrived, regardless of the legitimacy of their case, not hearing what their story was or why they tried to come to the UK, and just passing them off as somebody else's responsibility. That was what was wicked about that policy. So much of that kind of asylum system and the modern slavery system goes out of its way not to hear, not even to give people the basic dignity of listening to their story and understanding why they've tried to do something. And that, I think, is not a legitimate way to run that system. I recently read a line by the American author David Augsburger. Being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they are almost indistinguishable. And I think if we look at morality and migration, we could do an awful lot worse than simply putting in enough provisions that at the very least, people are heard, and they're heard legitimately. And secondly, I think as human beings, they deserve the dignity of being considered full members of society. And that means having the basic rights to pay and conditions, but it also means acknowledging their claim to family and connectivity. We gave out 100,000 visas to care workers to prop up the social care system over the past 2 years. And then we turned around and said, well, they couldn't bring family members with them. But they were already underpaid and they were already bailing us out. But how dare they want to bring partner or have any route to citizenship or settlement in this country? So we stopped them having that too. And that, I think, is a monstrous undermining of what is human nature, that sort of seeking of connection and family. And that leads me to just one big final point, which is the moral actor least discussed at all. And that is you and me and British society on the whole. I work for Medalle Trust. We support 600 people a year, modern slavery trafficking victims, 10 safe houses and 5 community projects. All people who are identified as victims of modern slavery. The majority of them are migrants, some trafficked in, others who came on visas and were exploited once they arrived. I dislike it when people tell me that modern slavery is an invisible crime. It's not invisible. It's thoroughly visible. It thrives because of UK consumers. It is ignored, not invisible. Those are not the same thing. The company that does construction or the farm that does agriculture know the number of workers that it takes to complete the task. And they know the amount of money they've given to an agency, and they can count. They know when it's not on the level, when the number of workers doesn't correspond to the amount of money they've put into it. When we see a car wash, which is too cheap to believe, that's because it isn't on the level. It is an illegal exploitation. That's not invisible. We can all see that the price is much lower than the one round the corner. It's not illegal in this country to be a prostitute, but it is illegal to be a pimp. There are thousands of women trafficked and pimped in this country every year, usually kept docile on drugs. The consumers are British, and they know. Everyone knows where the brothels are, or how would they have any customers? These are not invisible places. They're fully known. And those are the consumers are in our towns and in our cities. The thousands of men who are forced to work in criminal exploitation, growing drugs, those drugs aren't for export. Again, they're for British customers. We have the largest drug market in Europe. It is almost entirely consisted of drugs grown by people enslaved in this country, mostly Albanian and Vietnamese men. There are an estimated 120,000 people enslaved in some form in the UK today. That's a simple matter of supply and demand. And the demand is a society that in many industries, both legal, illegal, and somewhere in the middle, have come to rely entirely on exploited labour. Even at the softer end of that, for every Deliveroo, Uber, Just Eat, these are not companies which are making food. The profit margin is based on the workers. And if it seems like a remarkably good deal, it's because most of them are based on workers who are not being paid on the level. It's an industry based on exploitation. Ethical consumer choices, more than any government policy, would eradicate huge amounts of exploitative migration, both legal and illegal. If we spent a fraction of the money we spent on some of our border security measures, on simply enforcing labour standards, sending inspectors round farms and the care homes and the car washes, or on getting consumers to change behaviour, I guarantee that we would have a far bigger impact on the overall migration number. Why? Because if we killed off the demand, it would prevent this enormous industry in shipping people into the country from having anything to feed off. Put it all back together. I told you the most dangerous words in the politician's lexicon are, it is right that. I guarantee you that when it's about migration, it's all about, and you hear the words, it is right that, what follows will be either an economic case or an integration case, and it will certainly be around the needs of the state. It won't be consistent and it won't be convincing because the underlying thought isn't really there. The migration debate needs the voices of people on the move. It needs a better and more candid discussion on migration, which looks at the choices that people make and why they feel like they have to make them. And that can't be separated from the moral obligations around development and opportunity. And in a really honest debate about migration morality begins at home with the question of exploitation and a wide spectrum of slavery to unhealthy reliance on the underpaid or badly treated. And that is a moral question which may require some rather harder looks in the mirror sometimes.
Thank you very much, Ben. Very